Hello, LionBolt Kingdom. I always knew I wanted to be involved in a creative field. I'm an artist and storyteller, and I need to be able to channel that in my career, but figuring out what form that might take has been a little trickier. My original plan going out of high school was to do something involving art that was also lucrative, and the industry I set my sights on was games. In this video, I'll discuss what sorts of classes I had in my one and only year as a game design major at DePaul University, what I learned, and why it didn't work out. For new friends, I'm LionBolt, artist, animator, and author of the YA urban fantasy and mystery novel series Detective King. You can learn more about all that in the description. So I attended DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. At DePaul, rather than having semesters, we had 13-week quarters, meaning we'd have 3 sets of classes each school year, 4 if you take anything over the summer, hence quarters. Note that I was in game design for the 2018-2019 school year, so I don't know if these classes or the overall degree program has changed since then. This is simply my experience to give you an idea of what we worked on and studied. The first quarter I had fundamentals of game design and playgramming. Fundamentals focused on understanding the basic components of games, the mentality of a game designer, and how to articulate game concepts. In practice, a lot of this was doodling game concepts in notebooks, group projects where we designed simple games, things like a variant on tic-tac-toe, or a card game, a race or elimination game. Lots of construction paper and markers were involved. The biggest takeaway was how to write a GDD, or game design document, which is really just a document with information on the game you might use to pitch the game, and maybe use as a guide during development, like an outline. Things like premise, gameplay, rules, to things like target audience, marketing position, and game theory. Playgramming was a basic JavaScript class, learning how to code basic programs like a simple drawing program, animations, and text-based stories. This was still when I was fairly interested in programming. I was proud of the skills I built up over the course of the class, going from a very basic understanding to being able to create fully functional basic functions. I made this really basic horror game as my final project, and I later did use some of the skills I learned from that by making a little Detective King game using a text-based game app called Twine, which you can play on my website, lionboltkingdom.com. Go there in the description. In the winter quarter, I had 3D modeling, game development 1, animation for non-majors, and presentation and communication. As you can imagine, 3D modeling was all about how to make 3D models. We used Autodesk Maya, which is one of the standard 3D animation softwares, 3ds Max and Maxon being the others I know of. I had a bit of experience from high school in 3D modeling, but I got a lot better in this class. That being said, it wasn't quite the same as drawing something, thus the seeds of doubt were already being planted in me. This was my final project from the class, a cross between a rabbit and a crocodile. Perhaps more impressive is the second to last project here, the Office of the Overlord, I believe it was called. Game development built on some of those programming skills, building simple games using Game Maker, which is a 2D simple game engine. Think simple minigames with sprite artwork. My final project was an RPG with text cutscenes and even a boss fight. Looking at it now, it was pretty rough, but considering I did everything from art to writing to programming myself, it was the best I could do. The game, Standing Guard, centered around a knight, Colin, who dreams of adventure but is instead posted as a guard in a boring frontier town and must make do with the small-scale adventures he finds there. I planned on writing a novel based on the concept for the J-Novel contest this year, but I wasn't able to get going on it fast enough. Maybe someday. Animation class had some animation history and some basic principles of animation, with simple projects done using Adobe After Effects. I felt a lot more comfortable with 2D than 3D, and then the presentation and communication class was literally just a speech class, but focused on game pitches. I've always struggled with that sort of thing, but I had already taken a speech class at the community college I went to earlier, so it kind of felt unnecessary. Spring, the quarter from hell. I was already having doubts about whether game design was for me. I was struggling to see how some of the classes were supposed to prepare me for a serious job. And of the rest, it felt so base level I was concerned what would happen after graduation. My 3D modeling teacher once stressed to us that employers in creative fields like game design and animation don't really care about degrees, at least not nearly to the extent of a portfolio. I was worried I wouldn't have the portfolio I'd need to get hired anywhere. And even if I did, I wouldn't be doing quite what I wanted to do in the first place, which was to create stories. But I knew how difficult transferring would be, so I continued on into the spring. I had 3D animation, game development 2, games literacy, and practical scripting for games. The latter two classes would be what broke me, although as I'll get into, there was more to it. 3D animation covered the basics of animation in Autodesk Maya, basically fundamental stuff that applies to all animation, just in a 3D environment. 3D rigging was also involved, basically making the skeleton you use to move your 3D model around. Here's my final project. Game Development 2 expanded on the first half of the class, with projects done in groups. We'd have one person focused on things like rules, premise, and level design, another on artwork, and the third on coding. I did the artwork for this project. And I wrote the story and did everything on the cutscenes for this RPG project as our final. Including the pretty epic boss fight dragon, if I do say so myself. I remember there was a problem saving some of my work at the end, so I scrambled to redo what I had done the night before during class, before we were to present, and I managed to do it just in time, getting all the cutscenes finished for our classmates to test out. This was a fun class. It felt good to be part of a team, but it also underlined that I didn't feel like a perfect fit for any of the three basic roles. Games literacy was the biggest waste of time. It makes me mad it was a requirement. Honestly, I barely remember what we did in it because you could zone out and not miss anything. I think we only had 4 graded assignments over 13 weeks. I remember group projects were made games. Ours was a life-size Candyland. Again, construction paper and markers. This is a college course I am paying for, and we're playing with arts and crafts. Anyway, we also had an assignment to play a weird anime role-playing game over Discord. I'm not joking. My group did it for like 10 minutes and said this is stupid and called it a day. We got full credit. We also read some essays that ranged from how Atari consoles worked to the nature of games and play, which we'd really already covered in fundamentals 2 quarters ago. But what really broke me was practical scripting for games. By scripting, I don't mean writing stories or dialogue. I had screenwriting in my first quarter, which is where I developed Detective King, but it wasn't a formal part of the game design curriculum, so I skipped over it for this video. No, by scripting I mean code scripting, programming games. Up to this point I had experience in JavaScript, and I was reasonably comfortable with it, having worked on several projects using it by this point from my previous classes. This class threw me into the fire. I went from simple programs and making sprites move to programming levels in the Unity engine using C#, which is a far more advanced programming language and which I had zero experience with. I could barely follow along with class lectures, and unlike most of my classes, this class was not recorded, so I couldn't refer back to it later, despite DePaul advertising that all their classes are recorded in the program. So I was working on an animation in a hallway once. There's a common area with animation workstations I would sometimes work at after I became an animation major, and the campus tours would sometimes go by. I overheard one say that every class was recorded, and I ended up writing an email to the college telling them no, that wasn't true. The next time the tour came by, they clarified that most classes were recorded. When you go on these campus tours, it's a good idea to double check some of their info, try to find current students, and ask around with them rather than get the filtered stuff the tours give you. Anyway, this was an incredibly difficult class, and to make matters worse, there were only 3 rooms on campus, that I know of at least, that had computers that could run Unity, one of which was inaccessible to me, as I believe it was for graduate students. So I could only work on my homework whenever one of those 2 classrooms was empty. Not very impressive for a school with a game design program, when your computers can't even run game engines. I spent many long hours after school, alone, working to finish my projects with the limited grasp of programming I had. It was honestly a miracle I got most of my final project, which required me to program several puzzles and obstacles in a full 3D environment to work. Before the end of the quarter, I had decided to switch majors, and I told the professor I never intended to program again. He gave me an A, but I don't know if that was why. That class in particular was what finally convinced me to switch majors, but there were other underlying issues too. The game design program was fairly new and understaffed. There weren't many options for schedule flexibility, and for a commuter student like myself, that was really tough. I had to take the train every day. Had I continued, I'd have had to take all-night classes with no alternative options. On the other hand, I had several classes that felt like wastes of time and money, working on glorified arts and crafts, while on the other I was tossed into the deep end of programming and hated every second of it. Maybe if I had been eased into it, maybe if I had spent 2 years at a community college first, maybe if I'd known what the program was actually going to be like and had better advisors going in, I would email my advisor questions and not get a response for like 2 weeks, then maybe it could have been better, but in the end my heart wasn't into it. Game design was not my passion. I forgot which class it was, where someone said the key difference between games and film or animation was that in film, the creator was in control of the experience and the audience was along for the ride, while in games, the player was in control of the experience and could shape it to their will, within the boundaries of the game and the rules. I realized then that I was more interested in having the control and presenting stories the way I envisioned them, rather than creating something interactive that ends up deviating from my vision. It's the same reason I've never really gotten into Dungeons & Dragons. I'd love to create a campaign and design challenges, settings, and characters for it, but I would want to control too much, and at its heart, it's just not the medium for it. One other note, that practical scripting for games class was, I believe, the only class I have ever been in that had no girls in it whatsoever, which was kind of off-putting to me. And I think it says a lot about the state of the game design industry. The classes that I would have continued on into covered things like sound design, motion capture. I know there was an elective that had to do with VR, and then more intensive sort of programming and working with the Unity engine to make, actual games. DePaul also had a lot of sort of extracurricular projects that one could work on. As a commuter student, I couldn't really get into those. So what I learned, it wasn't all for naught. I refocused what it was I actually wanted to do. I learned of my preference for 2D rather than 3D animation, and I rolled out working with code or programming, like ever. I learned some fundamentals of animation, and I was able to work in a group to make some cool games, which felt good. I also learned that just because you have a degree doesn't mean you'll be ready for a job, or that you'll be in a position to get hired unless you have a really strong focused portfolio or reel, which, if I'm being honest, I don't really even have now. hence why I don't work at an animation studio right now. That may change someday, of course, and I will, of course, always be grateful for that screenwriting class that gave me a Detective King. That class was a game design degree requirement, though it wasn't part of the core curriculum, and it was not a requirement for animation for some reason, which doesn't really make sense to me. I guess I also learned that a lot of those degree requirements don't make a ton of sense. The college has a incentive to make you take more classes, and so a lot of your degree requirements, they're not really useful to what you want to do. You're just ticking off boxes, and there isn't really anything we can do about that, but it's deflating to realize that. I wouldn't say that it's all bad. I wouldn't say that it was all that if you are really passionate about game design that DePaul was necessarily a bad choice, but there were issues with it as I've laid out. So that was my experience in game design and why I changed majors. I'll talk about how school went from there in another video. I hope I highlighted some of the issues with the curriculum. I don't think game design is something easily taught, but rather something you gain experience by doing. I think it's also ultimately a collaborative medium, thus I should have done more to get involved in development teams outside of class. But again, as a commuter, that would have been tough for me to do. You need the passion, and instead I felt like I didn't quite fit, ultimately leading me to explore a different path, even if it was difficult and made me spend an extra year in school. Are you interested in a game design degree, or did you participate in one? Leave a comment, whether it's a bitter rant or a fun anecdote about the baffling institution that is university. Likes and new subscribers are also greatly appreciated to keep content on art, writing, and creative endeavors coming. Thanks for watching, see you next time.